I'm Chris Early. I lead digital publishing for Ubisoft out of San Francisco. That focuses on the North, Central, and South America regions. And then that same type of function is also in our Paris office. And what I'm going to talk about this morning is some of the things that we've learned in working with VR. We are kind of, if you want to be a little casual about it, we're a shiny object company when it comes to technology. We easily get interested in new technologies as they come out. We start working with them probably earlier in the curve than many large publishers do. And what we find is it helps us both figure out that technology and learn how we could blend what the learnings are from that new technology into what we're doing today. So with VR, it's particularly important because what we're discovering is there's kind of a new way of storytelling and a new way of talking to players when they're in the VR experience. So we have today announced publicly 3 games. 2 are released, Eagle Flight and Werewolves Within. And then later this month, we're going to be launching Star Trek Bridge Crew. So these are the titles that are out there. We have more that we're working on in our studios, but the learnings today will be from these titles. So we knew, we've been game developers for a long time. We just went through our 30th anniversary. We kind of figure we know this space. We knew a few things when it came to the beginning of VR. We knew that, if you move fast in VR, people are going to get uncomfortable. Uncomfortable is the VR, AR buzzword for nauseous or sick, right? Because apparently that's not so cool to say. We know that the session length needed to be short. When we talked to Oculus and to Vive, HTC at the beginning, and to Sony, we were advised that the best play session length for somebody in a VR headset was 7 to 9 minutes. Beyond that, people got uncomfortable, they felt too closed in, they got hot, it was not a good experience, so shoot for a 7 to 9 minute experience. Okay. And then we also realized, as many people think, that VR is antisocial. So that's where we kind of started a few years ago when we started working with VR, and just so I kind of get the sense, who's working in VR today? Show of hands. I got kind of, okay, a few. And who believes all these things like we did up there? Or at least one of them? All right, look at all you people who aren't raising your hands yet. Good morning. Time to wake up. So this is actually fairly common, right, these thoughts. And these are definitely what we believed when we started. And what we found out is that most of these things, in fact, are not true. So I'm going to talk about our learnings in each of these areas. And first off is with locomotion, or moving around. Right? So in VR, the part that makes you uncomfortable is when your eyes sense something that doesn't agree with what your ears feel. Right? So that connection physiologically in your brain or in your body, right, is a survival mechanism. It comes from the feeling of discomfort when our ancestors, lots and lots of years ago, would eat something that is not good, right? And so their stomach would start to get queasy. Their vision and their ear would no longer agree with what was going on, and they would then throw up and get rid of that poison. So it was a survival mechanism at that point in time. Today it happens when we're in cars or whatever, and you're looking down and you're reading, and you're going around corners fast, and when you don't have a frame of reference visually for what's happening outside, you're only looking at your book, your ears and your eyes don't agree, and you begin to feel carsick or nauseous. Right? So this is a huge problem when it comes to VR, because in many cases, you could put a headset on, be standing perfectly still, and then have a sense of motion in the VR space. So our question was, how do we solve that? Right? And we had some enterprising folks who said, this is the solution. Anybody know what this is? Any chemists in the audience? No? How about now? No? How about now? Okay? So it turns out, if we use the truth drug, scopolamine, it actually gets rid of nausea. And it has a few other side effects as well. But it's totally hard to distribute digitally with our software. So we looked for some other solutions of what we could do to make people more comfortable with motion. So Eagle Flight is a game where you're flying over Paris as an eagle, and it's fast. You're flying along. You can zoom it through buildings and through tight spaces. And what we realized was that one of the ways that we could have people be comfortable in this space was to let them use their head to control the motion. So in the game, where you look is where you fly. And what's more, if you tilt your head one way or the other, you're then banking further as you fly around. Right? What that does inside your head is as you move your head and your eyes agree that you in fact now are banking and turning, everything is in agreement. Right? Your ears know what's happening, your eyes register the same thing, so you're able to move very quickly in VR space and not have any sense of discomfort. I would say, the majority of people, 99+% of the people, don't have any sense of discomfort with this. And it was a step forward in VR locomotion because a lot of the games, as you'll see, use some form of teleporting. You look someplace and you teleport to that place. Well, that doesn't make for a very fun flying game, right? So this was one of the first things we learned, that actually using your head as the controller helps you with the discomfort. All right, the next thing is a fixed point of reference. And I'm going to curse you all for a minute here, not verbally, but by asking you a question. What in all of your vision right now is the single fixed point of reference that's been there all day? Your nose, right? And what you don't realize is, you see, actually now you all can see your nose pretty well, and it looks pretty funny up here, all of you trying to look at your nose, right? But what happens on a day-to-day basis is your brain sees your nose and processes it out. Nobody thinks about it anymore, right? And so, what it does for the rest of your brain, as you're thinking about motion, is it gives you a fixed point of reference. So as things move by, your nose is telling you, in fact, that you are stuck in space and your eyes are seeing certain things. Well, when you remove that and you're in the VR space, you don't see your nose anymore. Your brain loses that point of reference. So what we did in Eagle Flight is we put in a beak, right? It's pretty small, kind of like your nose. Most people don't see it on a regular basis, but that one addition of that little bit of the bottom of the screen has a lot of more people feel comfortable because now there's a fixed point of reference, just like what we're seeing normally in the VR space. Once again, we got to that place where mimicking what we see in a regular physical space works to have you be more comfortable in a VR space. And after a while, your brain processes out that beak as well because it realizes it's just that fixed point of reference. So the next thing that tends to make people a little uncomfortable with motion in VR is when things get a little too close, right, and you're moving a little bit too fast. Right? This blurriness or this fast motion is also, something that we developed evolutionary-wise over time. As watching out from the sides of your eyes was that fast motion was usually some predator coming in to get us, and so we wanted to be very close and very aware of that. But when that happens too often, too much, and you're too close to something, it's very distracting and it can cause discomfort. So they solve that, with animals sometimes with physical blinders. But that's tough to do from a gaming standpoint, and it doesn't really look that good along with your VR headset. So what we developed was a concept of dynamic blinders. What we do is, and you'll see in a moment on the video, is when you get too close to a surface in the game world and you're moving fast, and it would be normally blurry and it would have that kind of an impact on you, we dynamically shade that area of the screen. And it's very similar to what happens with race drivers when they talk about when they're in the zone, they're driving very fast around the track. They get a sense of tunnel vision where they're really focused on the point ahead and they're not paying attention to everything else that's going on around them, right? And so that progressive darkening and lightening of the screen happens when you get too close to something. And what that does is most players don't even notice it because they're focused on where they're flying and where they're trying to get through whatever window or past whatever obstacle. But that tends to reduce the blur factor and makes people much more comfortable. So the good news is, for us as digital distributors of software, we don't need this drug. Bad news for Big Pharma because we're not a new market. So the next thing we'll talk about is the session length, right? And you remember I told you that we were told 7 to 9 minutes was the right session length at the beginning. So we then started to look at, as we put our games together, how long were our testers playing in the games? And in Werewolves Within, that's a game that is essentially a table game where you sit around and you figure out who's the werewolf. You talk to each other, right? We found that our session length was much more than 10 minutes. And so we thought, okay, maybe we were doing something wrong. We started rolling it out to more people. Now that it's been a released product, when you take a look at the number of sessions that are over 10 minutes in length, 86% of them are over 10 minutes in length. And that's startling compared to what we were told originally was the right amount of time for a game session. And okay, we thought, okay, maybe we're wrong. What do players want from us? How long do they want the game sessions to be? And Google ran a study before the PSVR was launched that asked people, what do you want from your VR experience in the Sony system? And, we thought, probably like a lot of people, that the early type of experiences that would get people into VR would be those quick experiences, those short ones, the ones that everybody knows based on casual game concepts. It turns out that not very many people were interested in that type of experience. And as part of the same survey, Google asked, do you really want something that's more like the experience that you get in, the regular PlayStation experience? And many, many more people wanted that. Right? They want the longer experience. They want something similar to what they have now. So we figured is, okay, well, players want longer experiences. And it's not really a surprise when you think about it, because we've had a real-world example of this before. When IMAX started, if anybody remembers back to that time, it was a novelty. There were only a few IMAX theaters around. And what did they show? They consistently showed helicopter trips of flying over rugged islands where the ground dropped out from underneath you suddenly, and you had that moment, that kind of wow moment for a second about you went over the cliff, or you flew next to the waterfall. And these were all 10-minute sessions that were not particularly engaging. They weren't telling a story or anything along those lines, but it was really showing you the impact of having the large screen. And they were made that way because the industry in the beginning said that large of a screen and that intense of a sound system is going to cause people to get sick. Right? It's going to be too much. It's going to overwhelm their senses. So you're going to have to go, and this is what was happening in the IMAX industry, you're going to have to go for short experiences like this movie. Well, just like with what we've learned here, it turns out as soon as people started filming in IMAX and producing feature-length movies in IMAX, it's what people want. They go and they watch, and nobody gets. Some people do have a problem with the big screen, but they don't go to that show, right? So once again, as soon as the film industry, started making the long sessions, the long movies, that's what people liked, and that's what people wanted. So it turns out people, in fact, do want longer experiences for their VR and for their movie experiences. They want to be engaged. So then let's talk about antisocial VR. We all kind of can picture this guy in his mom's basement, right, who's busy playing and isolated from everybody. And that's not what we wanted to think about from a VR standpoint overall. One of our studios, Red Storm in North Carolina in the United States, started focusing on social VR. What could they do in the VR space that would help enhance or encourage social behavior? And they've developed 2 games so far, Werewolves Within and Star Trek Bridge Crew. And Werewolves Within is, like I said, that party game where you sit around a campfire virtually, and one of you is a secret werewolf. And nobody else knows who it is. And through your conversation and the questions you ask, it's your job to figure out who is the werewolf. And there's some abilities of the other players. And then at the end of the round, you have a vote. And if the person who gets voted to be killed is the werewolf, all the villagers win. And if it's not, then the werewolf wins because they were able to hide their identity. Right? And so let's take a quick moment and so you can see the dynamics of that game.
Welcome to the werewolf-plagued village of Galveston and the world of Werewolves Within. Werewolves Within is a social deduction game. As a player, it's your job to figure out which of the other players are trustworthy and who's being less than truthful.
You have no solid evidence against me.
You gotta prove that you're not the werewolf. Wait, me? No, I'm definitely a gossip.
Oh my gosh, I guessed right.
I mean, that's exactly what a werewolf would say, but...
Come on!
It was me the whole time.
I have determined that Javier is a gossip.
Cool, thank you.
So that means either Gabe actually is the houndsman, or he's the werewolf.
No!
I told you it was Cece.
The werewolves win!
So it's a very fun party game, and you can play with people you know, or you can play with complete strangers. The next game that they're working on, which will be released later this month, is Star Trek Bridge Crew. And this is a game where you and up to 3 other of your friends can pilot the Enterprise or other starships from the Star Trek universe and go on missions to save the, explore and save the known or unknown universe. And so just to give you a little setup, and then we're going to see a video about it as well. This can be played, by people either in the same room if you have that many VR setups, or usually by people elsewhere who are not in the same room together. And what you're going to see in the next video is less about gameplay and more about the social interaction that's happening while people are playing the game. Right? So in the VR headset, you are one of 4 positions, the captain, engineering, things like that, where you're controlling the ship, and you're having to collaborate with your friends to be able to solve the mission. There is a single-player version as well, so you can control all of it yourself, but what we wanted to highlight today is the social side of it. So let's take a look when the Engadget crew came in to play an early version of Star Trek Bridge Crew.
Message from Starfleet.
Captain, we have an emergency. Starfleet has lost all contact with Starbase ELO 4, and we fear the worst.
Alright, you heard the man. We have a job to do. Let's go and do it.
Engaging warp, sir. Here we go.
Matthew, can you begin scanning the area, please?
Scanning. That doesn't look good. Uh-oh. There's a Klingon coming. Shall I scan him, sir?
Shields up, please.
Shields on. They're firing at us, sir.
Aaron, power to phasers and shields.
Got it.
Alright, Matt, let's give him something to deal with. Phasers and photon torpedoes. Quick as you can!
Yes, sir. Now, fire! Pepper in him like pepper jack cheese.
That's not a phrase.
Still bringing us around.
Just nice, regular pulses.
Captain, I'm pulsing. I'm pulsing. Are we still talking about Star Trek?
Nick, stay with him.
Turning us around, sir. Scotty, I love you.
Damn it, man, you're beautiful.
Nick, get us out of here. We're about to die.
Get us back in, Sonny Jim.
So people have a lot of fun when you put them in a social environment in VR and they're having to collaborate. When you see the game setting, you realize that here are people, right? And in VR, you realize there are other people, real people, and you're interacting with them. And, we were worried a little bit along the way about how do we make it as real as possible? How do we create a sense of social presence so it doesn't feel like you're talking to a bunch of, AI constructs that are there, but in fact, these are real people, and you can have that type of interaction. Well, you certainly hear the voice, but there's a lot of other things we learned along the way that became important to having it be an immersive experience, to have it be something where you actually felt the presence of another human being in the space. And the first was when we actually started networking the head and the torso together and working it with the voice as well. So if you sit here and watch me talking, right, I could talk quietly with my hands down, or that would be quieter this way, right? But when you actually see that I'm talking more loudly or gesturing more emphatically, right, the fact that my head and body are moving with the same tempo as my voice, you realize that, or we realize that as humans, is that's a real behavior, right? And so when we take and listen to somebody's voice in the game, we actually modulate what's happening with their head and their body with the tone of their voice. Now, the game isn't actually listening and parsing what the person is saying, but it's listening to the volume and the tempo. And then it goes ahead and animates that as well. So what you saw in both those games is you can either play with a controller or with gesture controls. And in which case, with gesture, you're moving your arms. If you happen to be playing with a controller, the computer takes over and adds a bunch of gestures in on top of what you would normally be able to do in terms of pointing at somebody or gesturing to yourself to make it be realistic. That sense of seeing it matching the voice and the body adds realism to it, adds a sense of social presence. We've done the same thing with lips and with the facial expressions. Again, we're not listening to the words somebody is saying, but we are listening for the sound bites that are going on, and we're animating the lips, and we do it a little bit better than some of the old movies to match the motion that's going on with the sound that's coming out. Now, if there was someone who could actually lip read, could they understand what someone is saying? No, because it's just making, if I happen to make a loud, long sound, the character's mouth is going to open a little bit during that period of time, and then it will close again as I stop making sound. That's close enough, and our brains tend to do the rest to make it say like, oh, that's actually what the guy is saying. His lips are moving, right? So it adds again to that sense of realism. The next thing that we learned, and it was quite accidental, was the concept of eye locking or head locking, right? So you know this, especially if you're in a relationship. When you're talking to someone who you're in a relationship with, and you're busy looking somewhere else, right? The next thing you hear is, hey, look at me, we're talking, right? So that's essentially what happens here in VR as well. When you're talking to someone in VR, and you're not looking at them, it doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like there is a connection going on. So what we realize is that in general, when someone is looking towards another player, like across the bridge or around the campfire, we just snap the head to face directly at that player, right? We allow the eyes to then still have a natural sense of motion as it's going, but that head lock is what makes it seem real, like someone is paying attention. And in addition, what we do with the eyes is, especially like in the campfire setting, when someone on either side talks, we cause the eyes to flick briefly over towards whatever the new source of sound is. So it starts to look very realistic, and yet feels like someone is paying attention to you, which again adds to the sense of presence in the game. Speaking, gestures, and hand tracking, I mentioned that a little bit before. The fact that you can add gestures in makes a huge difference, because we process, when we see constructs going, we realize what is human and what is not. In fact, it's as simple as a head motion. In our early experiments, we had a stationary body, and we just put a block head on the stationary body, and we put two people in VR facing each other, and they both had these block heads, right? That was the only humanistic characteristic, was the block head, and we animated the block to move as the person moved their regular head, right? Just that one piece of information alone was easy to tell when the other person was a human and when they were an AI. Because we all do a whole bunch more motion than we ever code into a game from an AI perspective. My head bounces all around left and right while I'm talking. It's just, we know, somehow, instinctively, we recognize that that is another human behind that construct and not an AI. Again, helping us with the social presence overall. And then the last thing, of course, which adds to the realism of the environment overall, is we create a sense of where the sound is coming from. So when someone to my right speaks, I hear it from my right. When someone from my left speaks, I hear it from my left. I can hear it across the campfire or around the bridge, all adding to that sense of social presence. So those features that we kind of discovered along the way, along with a bunch of other almost sociological functions, right, are what helps create a sense of presence in the game. And thinking in VR, when you have people together, it ends up being super important that people feel like they're with somebody else instead of feeling like they're just in an AI space. It creates a different sense of engagement and participation from the players. So here's a quick little video where you can see the gestures and emotes that are going on in a game. This is when this game had only controller support. So all the motions that someone is doing by pointing or whatever happen to be done by the controller. But even at that point, you can see, if you've been watching the guy, oh, it was supposed to loop, but well, if you saw for a moment in the guy that was in the bottom left, he actually was gesturing more with his hands also. I mean, that he's working with a controller, nothing happens, but that tells us that he felt engaged. He felt like he was in the space. So there it goes. Then the last thing from social presence standpoint, when, what we found is, and we worried about this to begin with, we're potentially putting a bunch of strangers in a space together, asking them to figure out, to one of them to pretend like they're a werewolf, and for everyone to lie to each other for a game session, right? And how is that going to work, right? One of the things we found, and you might see this on Halloween or other, Mardi Gras or other type of events as well, is when you put somebody behind a costume, it removes some social inhibitions. People are much more likely to open up and start talking when they're behind some form of a costume. And in the case of Werewolves Within, we don't allow people to configure their avatars themselves, it's actually, I think, better. It's proving to be better play results when people drop into one of these roles. And you will see somebody act also along with the role of being the barmaiden or the blacksmith as well. And the communication that goes on is in fact real and is role-playing. And certainly you can understand how the role-playing side of it comes into the Star Trek side as well, as people step into the role as the captain or the engineer or the helmsman, etc. So does it work? Well, let's take a look at some of the data that we have from Werewolves Within. And these are the play sessions that I was talking to you about before, that 86% of were more than 10 minutes. And in fact, we see that 45%, almost 50% of the people spend more than an hour with the game per session. Okay, that is way longer than we expected. A Werewolves Within game can last anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes, right, from an overall standpoint. So that's the session. So people who are spending more than an hour in there are playing 6+ sessions in a row. Whether they're playing with their friends or being randomly match-made, that's a lot more use than we anticipated. And so is it for our top person who's been in the headset for over 500 hours playing just this game. And I have to imagine he plays other games as well. And that's a lot of time spent in VR, and a lot of time spent lying to people too. So clearly we've done something right from the social side of things. But our question was, are we unusual? Did we hit something that was maybe better or worse? Or is just everybody spending this much time in VR? So what we did is we looked at some data from Steam Spy, which is an independent company that shows, that analyzes the data coming out of Steam, and looked at the VR titles and looked at play session length. And it turns out that Werewolves Within is, in fact, the #1 longest played game per session of any of the VR titles that are out there. So clearly, what we take away from this is that social is engaging, right? Social is, in fact, something that can make for a better play session. And when you think about it, Werewolves Within is a very simple game concept, right? There's not a lot of animation that goes on. These people sit around the campfire. That's all they do. They don't run around. They don't shoot each other. The length of that game, the value of it comes from the social side of what's going on. And making it real, making the social presence seem real, was a key part of that. Now, the other thing that we've seen is that there's a few things that we need to keep working on in the VR space as well. Well, actually, there's a lot of things. By no means do we know everything there is to know. Like I mentioned earlier, we're figuring out new things all the time and how to tell stories in the VR space. But we also need some new things around anti-griefing. Griefing is when, it's also trolling. It's basically when someone is setting out to make someone else's experience bad. And it might be standing too close to them, blocking their view, or making rude gestures, or saying inappropriate things. And so we, instead of the normal voice chat, game result of just muting the player, we found mute has to have a new meaning in VR. Mute also means that that person is bounced out of a zone of comfort around a player, so they can't really block your view. Mute means you can't see that person's hand gestures anymore either, because you could do all kinds of rude gestures with your hands, against somebody else that would be part of that griefing. And people are creative. We're learning new ways that people are figuring out how to grief on a regular basis. So we keep having to update the game as well to help maintain the social order. So it is a new medium for us. It's a new way that people are interacting and figuring out what's appropriate. We also saw, and you can see here on the top, for Werewolves Within, it's a dynamic where people are seated around a campfire, facing each other. That tends to promote more conversation. We didn't know this when we started. Actually, there's probably sociologists who know this, but we didn't figure that part out, right? And the bridge where everybody is sitting and facing the screen, inherently the conversations seem to be less there, right? So it's something to think about from a design standpoint when you're going and looking at designing in VR space where you want social, is how do you have the people oriented? How are they facing one another, or how are they facing an objective? And in fact, the folks who end up facing each other are much more likely to converse. And they're also very likely to converse if they have a reason to do so, right? And this is where you have to look at balancing the gameplay mechanics with the social requirements of the game to figure out what are you going to do to help seed conversation, which is really kind of the last part. What is a social activity? Now, in Werewolves Within, it's easy because the social activity is the game itself. You need to ask questions of the other players to be able to tell who is the werewolf and who is a safe villager. For Star Trek, it's less obvious. You could, in fact, play the game as a single player and be able to have it all. But what we did in the multiplayer space is we gave each one of the people at a different station information that none of the other players have. And so to be able to effectively play the game, they have to communicate that information to the rest of the players. So it's not overdone, but it is enough information that it forces that conversation to take place. It forces the social interaction, or at least gives a reason for it, right? You could try to play the entire game without communicating, but it'd be a little tough because the captain gets a briefing, the helmsman has information about where they're going. The reason for social interaction becomes particularly important. So all this put together, had us go to back to that place of saying, well, does it really work? Right? Have we really been successful? Is social VR fun, or did we just figure out a way to hook people into playing in the game for a while? And in fact, did it really work with a bunch of strangers? Because what you saw with the Engadget team is certainly fun, but those guys knew each other ahead of time. So I can always see that playing with a bunch of friends I know is going to be great. But what about, how does that work when it's a bunch of strangers? And what we've come back with is that there are plenty of folks in this space who have talked about what a great time they've had in Werewolves Within, and what a great time they've had in some of the early betas of Star Trek. In Werewolves Within, since it's an open environment, people are matching with friends or matching with people that they don't know. And what we found is that people who are matching with folks that they don't know are still saying that they've made new friendships, right? They've discovered and met new people and been able to talk with people online. And that is part of the reason that we see when sessions go on and on, is people just continue on to the same space. More so than any game that we've done recently, people are saying that this has helped them, at a social level, of getting out and talking to folks in the community and making new friends. So I'd say, yeah, we did succeed, really. We did succeed in creating social presence with these games, and we're learning on an ongoing basis of what it takes to code in virtual reality, to create a social presence in virtual reality, to tell stories a new way in virtual reality. So thank you very much for letting me talk to you about some of my what we've learned about coding in virtual reality. And I have a few minutes for any questions that anybody might have.
Anyone? Okay, so
right.
I have a question.
Okay.
So you mentioned that adding gestures and social cues within VR game helps people become more comfortable with other characters.
Yes.
Was there such a thing as too much of a gesture? As in people moved too much that they went into uncanny valley?
So could somebody move too much? Yes. Right? The real question then becomes, does it interfere with gameplay, or is it a method of social interaction? We have all seen people in a sports event go crazy after they score a goal, doing things that they don't normally do on a regular basis. We see the same thing happen in the VR space, in Star Trek, for example, when people have managed to shoot down and be successful in a meeting, they're high-fiving in virtual space. Right? Of course, there's no physical feedback of what's going on, so it's kind of funny to watch somebody sitting there all by himself trying to high-five the person next to them, right? Because they're kind of like, looking or doing two hands and going crazy. It really tends to be much more about the emotion that's going on at the moment that defines what's too much. Too much when everybody's sitting calmly turns into griefing. Right? And then we need to figure out a way of how do we let people mute other players to remove those gestures. Too much when I'm too close to you, interfering with you turns into trolling, and we don't want people to do that either.
Any questions from the audience? Yes, from the back.
Hi, thanks for the talk, great talk.
You're welcome.
Regarding the hardware, like any other industry, how much time do you think it would take for the hardware to be A, affordable for the general audience, and B, convenient for usage? Because I'm guessing that's going to be the deal breaker, as we move on.
Yeah, probably the biggest limiter today, if you think of it that way, from the high definition VR, is the number of headsets that are in the market. So that tends to grow year on year. We've seen folks have sales so far. There's been some announcements of some newer, lower priced headsets that are coming. I think what we've seen is the mobile headsets that were the cardboard to begin with and gear. Now we have Daydream, which is a little bit more capable, and there's going to be a merging, I think, of hardware trends with some price changes. The real challenge then is, how do we get people to try them, to experience VR, and to have a good experience doing it. Right? And this becomes something that's a burden on all of us, a responsibility for all of us who are in the space, to make sure that whatever demos that get done for players are a quality demo. Because when in fact somebody goes and plays VR for the first time, puts on the headset, does something, and then doesn't feel good, we've lost that player for probably a good period of time. They're like, okay, I tried that VR thing and I got sick and it was terrible and it's not for me, right? But what we need to do is figure out those good demo experiences to get as many people doing it. When will be the right amount of headsets that are in the market? There's a lot of headsets on mobile devices today where you can have, I think, a decent success in the mobile space making a VR game. Commercial success. On the high definition headset, if you watch your costs, I think you can be successful today. You know, if you look at some of the reporting agencies, they say there's a couple million high definition headsets in the market, and I think most people do what we're doing, which is they make their VR game for all of the headsets, for each platform, for all the platforms. And in fact, our games, we make them so that they work and play together in one player pool. So it does make it so that there's more players there. But that is, in fact, as you identified, the number one thing that will speed up the industry is when there's more headsets that are out there.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Chris Early.
Thank you.